Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to the Finding You podcast. I'm Dr. Brad Reedy. Today is Tuesday, March 24th, 2026. Tonight, I'm going to be talking about addiction, both the development of addiction, how I think about it in a spiritual, psychological sense, and also how the approaches to treating addiction and substance abuse disorder, codependency, how they all share some common themes that harken back to the spiritual, psychological dilemma that I'll be talking about tonight. Before I get into that, let me just go into the housekeeping items. For those of you that might not be aware, and for some of you attending this evening, we have launched the Inner Circle for our Finding You podcast, which is automatic if you're an alumni of our programs. If not, you can subscribe for $100 per year or $10 a month. That gives you access to the live broadcast like this one now. Or you can also attend, listen to content that's not available to the public, including the Ask Me Anything episodes. So if you're interested in that, go to our website or email us at info@findingyouprograms.com. This will be the last request, but I'm looking for families. A very well-known publication has reached out to me asking for families with young adults who have struggled with mental health, specifically with some addictions and substance abuse issues. So if you are that and you want to tell your story, I'd be happy to pass along your information, pass along their information so you can vet them first, look at what they've written, and look at what they published before, and look at the publication before you decide to respond and participate. If you're interested, email us at info@findingyouprograms.com. My new book, my new co-authored book, Stay in the Room, will be out April 7th. You can order now for pre-order on Amazon. Just go to Amazon and look up Stay in the Room. It'll ship on April 7th, and I'm looking forward to that. My other two books, The Journey of the Heroic Parent and The Audacity of You, are available on Amazon and Audible. Audible will be coming later for our new book, Stay in the Room. If you're looking for a deep dive, if you want to understand your participation in the identified patient's issues, if you want to see your participation in the addiction that is a family disorder, a family organizes around, that offering is our Finding You Intensive. The next available one is April 8th, also May 13th. So April 8th or May 13th. If you're interested, reach out to us via our website or emails for all other inquiries. For private intensives, if you're looking for a coach or a therapist who works in this model, go to our website or email us at that email, info@findingyouprograms.com. Our next support group for the alumni will be April 15th. That's the third Wednesday of each month. Reach out to us to register and get the link. If you're looking to attend a workshop of mine, my daughter Emma and I will be back at the Omega Institute in Rhinebeck, New York, in the Hudson Valley, July 12th through 17th this summer. So if you're interested, you can go to the Omega website at eomega.org. We will also be at the Art of Living Retreat Center, September 27th through October 2nd. And that workshop that we'll be running in both locations is The Audacity to Be You, Learning to Love Your Horrible, Rotten Self. It's kind of a blend between, it's not quite as personal and deep as the therapeutic intensive, and it's much more interactive and provocative, dynamic. It really digs into it more than just a lecture sitting. So if you're looking for something kind of in between, those are the offerings. You can also email us or go to our website to find out more. With that, let me get into tonight's content. My favorite description of addiction, and I'll say a few of these tonight, but the first one is this idea that addiction is a chronic attempt to not be present in your own life. Now, in some ways, the goal of tonight's broadcast is to demystify addiction, to make it less other, less something that we can't relate to that's out there, and understand how closely we are related to it. So addiction can look like working. It can look like focusing on other people's problems. It can look like exercise. It can look like reading. It can look like television. And of course, it can look like its more harmful and more obvious forms of drug and alcohol dependency. But the point is that anything in our life that takes us away from being present. Somebody once said that mental illness is the inability to listen to the whisperings of our own soul. If we can't get quiet enough, if we can't allow ourselves to feel, if we can't be present with our circumstances, sometimes what that looks like is that there's something that's calling me, a conversation I need to have with my spouse, a boundary that I need to set with my mother, a difficult step that I'm navigating regarding my children, whatever that might be. There's some whispering, some calling that I'm being called to, asked for, and I'm unwilling or unable because I'm afraid, because I don't have the security of attachment to know that my wings will soften my landing, that I can survive no matter what the outcome of the circumstance. When it gets to be that dilemma, oftentimes the only way to bear it is to take an anesthetic, to take something that will change our brain chemistry and give us a feeling of wellness, a feeling of safety, maybe a feeling of being empowered, right? It can give us some drugs really appeal to that ego inflation. So when we feel powerless and small, we might be more drawn to that kind of substance, that high. Or if we are anxious and scared, we'll be drawn to drugs that have a numbing or a soothing effect, a calming effect. When you think about the trigger of our mental health symptoms, and how mental illness is prolonged exposure to something that's overwhelming to us, it makes sense why we would turn to substances, why we would turn to behaviors like screens to try to escape, because we don't have that base, that nervous system that can withstand the storms of life, that can withstand the anxieties of life, that can buoy us up when we're feeling overwhelmed. So to drink, for example, oftentimes alcohol is referred to colloquially as liquid courage. It takes away our fear. In so many ways, and I've said this to young people for years, in so many ways, it's a spiritual quest, a spiritual thirst that we're really hungering for, that feeling of safety, that all is well in the universe. And maybe even in the most specific way, it can be an attempt for the spiritual transcendent experience of being one with your higher power. But when it is accomplished through these kinds of behaviors like substance use or substance abuse, then our life can easily spiral out of balance. So addiction really can't be named by the substance that we're using, although some substances don't lend themselves to casual, recreational, occasional use. Some have highly addictive qualities that are often, those qualities are an immediate high, right? A quick reaction and a powerful reaction. Some of those substances that we ingest don't lend themselves to, like I said, a more casual, occasional usage. But outside of that, we can really understand that the substance doesn't define the addiction. It is our relationship to it and our relationship to life, to ourselves, to the people around us. And if we find those things overwhelming, if we can't find a suitable or acceptable way out of the feeling or the dilemma that we find ourselves in, then we can be very tempted to ingest a chemical that will give us that sense of unity, of connection, of safety, of empowerment. And if we haven't developed the psychological structure, like I mentioned, those kinds of experiences can quickly become our greatest priority, something we go back to, something that causes our life to lose its balance. You know, when we talk about the treatment of addiction, my method is, of course, psychotherapy. So what I say to people often is, try psychotherapy. And if psychotherapy doesn't make a dent in your addictive behaviors, then you might need something more structured like a 12-step program. But psychotherapy is a kind of mindfulness. It's an attempt to be present in your life. And so questions that have become a cliche, a therapy cliche, like how do you feel, illustrate the idea that we're asking the client to be present in their own life. How are you feeling? What's going on? How did that impact you? What do you think? What's going on in your body right now? Can you feel a sensation in your body? What's your impulse, your instinct? What do you want to do? We're asking you to spend time looking and sitting and being with yourself. And very importantly, if the therapist is too eager to be helpful as they see it, to fix the problem, then they'll rob the individual of their psychological and spiritual task. So the job of the therapist is to sit with the client in what I like to call their unsolvable problems. And over time, with repeated exposure to an authority figure, like a therapist, who can sit with you, you learn to sit with yourself. So if we trace back the environmental contributions to addiction, what we would say is that the child didn't have a big person, a parent, a caregiver, who could sit with them in their unsolvable problems, in their pain, in their sadness, in their grief, in their hurt, in their fear. The parent didn't have the adequate internal resources, the nervous system, the capacity to offer themselves as a co-regulator to the child. So the child's nervous system, which is patterned after the caregivers, is inadequately structured, built. And if you grow up with an inadequate nervous system, inadequate to the tasks and challenges that this life presents, you will seek ways to comfort yourself. And for the addict, traditionally we're talking about the addict, we're talking about somebody who will ingest substances that will give them an immediate experience of the transcendent, of the safety, of the empowerment, even a sense of enlightenment, of knowing things. But oftentimes, people in recovery, people who identify as alcoholics and addicts of all kinds, not just drug and alcohol, but process disorders, sex addictions, computer screen addictions, other kinds of addictions, those kinds of folks will tell you often, it doesn't matter how much I talk about my feelings, I will go back to my addiction. They might say, I use when I'm happy, I use when I'm sad, I use to celebrate, I use for in place of grief. So if therapy doesn't get the trick, I would then say, then you might need something more structured that has specific steps, specific accountability. Somebody, a mentor, a sponsor who's assigned to you, who can kind of walk you through the very practical day-to-day steps in the middle of the night sometimes. Now, I wouldn't suggest to the individual seeking out sobriety to necessarily stop psychotherapy. Because while the 12 steps do offer a really fantastic plan for treating addiction and issues directly related to it, it lacks some of the breadth that psychotherapy can offer you. So for me, therapy can always be that safety net, that underpinning that supports any part of the process. Meditation is the ability to be present with yourself, to be present with your body, to sit with, to observe, to develop an observer's mind. Sometimes people get sobriety through a spiritual awakening that can be associated with 12 steps or not. In many cases, an important part of a recovery system that happens through the institution sometimes of church or of 12 steps, and I'm separating those two. Something that's inherent in those processes and those structures is a support group, membership, that idea that you belong. You know, I think one of the problems with modern religions is that they don't offer the sinner, if you will, a sense of being welcomed. It's so often about being good, wearing your Sunday best, right? You're showing up to your institution of worship, looking your best. In contrast, in 12-step meetings, you could confess to the most horrendous litany of behaviors associated with your use, and the essence of what you'll receive is the welcoming spirit. You're in the right place. You can sit by me. You belong here. One of the things I think that's a part of this is creating, like I said, a group and a belonging, but also creating a purpose. My son was just telling me about this study that he'd read. He has a master's degree in organizational behavior. And he was telling me about the study where they would take mice and they would put them in freezing cold water for no reason, randomly. And over time, the mice became neurotic. They developed health problems and they died before their natural age would have suggested. But they took another group of mice and they did the same thing, dunking in the freezing cold water, but they gave the mouse a treat after the dunk. And something remarkable occurred. In this case, the mice thrived. It even had health benefits from their cold plunge. And part of what is theorized, this working hypothesis, is they found purpose in their suffering. Viktor Frankl said, if we can find a how, he was actually borrowing from Nietzsche. If we can find a why, we can bear almost any how. If you can find a purpose, a reason, something bigger than yourself to tie into, then the problem sort of sorts itself out. So for the addict, it's building a life and having relationships that are so valuable that to lose them would be too great of a cost. So part of the sobriety is to remain connected to the life that we have built. So going back to the original idea that addiction is a chronic attempt to not be present in your life, part of it is to make a life worth living. Now, at the outset, the question always is this a genetic disease or an environmental disease? And some of the modern speakers like Gabor Mate really emphasize the environmental factors, childhood trauma. But anybody who studies psychology knows that it's always both genetics and environment. What percentage of it is which, we don't quite know. But we all know that every human being has certain predispositions, limitations based on their genetic makeup. And depending upon how the environment presents itself, those genetics then are turned on or off. If you experience a certain amount of stress and you have a certain kind of genetic makeup, you could reach this threshold where your trauma starts to show up behaviorally with substance use disorder, etc. Where somebody exposed to the same kind of environment might not have that predisposition. But the point of my stopping here with this principle is forget about this idea of which is it. It's always both. I've never heard, ever, a compelling argument that would suggest that it is solely one or the other. And I've been spending about 35 years trying to find that. The Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh wrote this. He said, many people aspire to go to a place where pain and suffering do not exist. A place where there is only happiness. This is a rather dangerous idea, for compassion is not possible without pain and suffering. We should not try to escape from our pain. We should look at it directly. Looking at suffering deeply, we will have deep insight into its nature, and the path of transformation and healing will be present itself to us, will present itself to us. To me, the definition of hell is simple. It is a place where there is no understanding and no compassion. We have all been to hell. We are acquainted with hell's heat, and we know that hell is in need of compassion. So here's some principles here that I'm talking about. We do have this idea that life is ultimately something that we can master and that we can avoid pain. It's in our culture, it's in our media, it's in our collective consciousness, right? You can see it almost everywhere. And what Thich Nhat Hanh is teaching us is without suffering, we miss perhaps the most important ingredient in the human experience, and that is compassion. So I realized this years ago because people have always asked me, why do we need to suffer? Why do we need to experience pain? And for me, this is a really big part of that answer. We experience these things. We need these things because that's how we develop compassion, understanding. Actually, we experience grace for other people. We come to know in our own suffering what we need if we stay conscious and present with it. And then subsequently, we understand that that's what other people need also. We reduce judgments. We reduce our sense of self-righteousness, and we're able to connect and offer people the grace that we found so healing, or that we found absent in our own healing process. And over time, this compassion, this connection to another person, in so many cases, is the only thing that can be offered. If you lose somebody you love, if you lose a child or a spouse or somebody important in your life, no amount of therapy can take that away from you. What it can do is offer you support. What a person in a group can do is offer you the sense that you're not alone. And while that might not seem enough to some of my new listeners, I will tell you that's all that's available at times, certain circumstances. And because it's subtle and it moves slower than we would like it to, we think it's not important or it doesn't exist. But talking to people that are on the other side of that grief experience, that loss experience, that painful experience, we hear from them that it makes all the difference in the world. Carl Jung wrote a letter to the founder of the 12-step program, Bill W. And in the letter, he wrote this about a particular individual. He said, his craving for alcohol was the equivalent on a low level of the spiritual thirst of our being for wholeness. Expressed in medieval language, the union with God. So one of the things that folks that are struggling with addictive behaviors really like to hear when I share with them is that you're seeking the spiritual transcendent experience, and that alcohol and drugs or other addictive behaviors give you a temporary glimpse of what that would feel like. The problem is that if that's how you're getting the transcendent experience, you're going to need more and more. The drug or the alcohol or the behavior will be less and less effective, and you're going to need more and more of it. In contrast, if you develop that experience through practice, meditation, psychotherapy, spiritual work, prayer, whatever it is that is your path, then you have the ability to recreate it. Then you know, under stress or under trial, you can go back to your practice, whatever your practice is, and get it. And it doesn't become the self-defeating process that addictions do. William James, the philosopher, in 1902, wrote this: the sway of alcohol over mankind is unquestionably due to its power to stimulate the mystical faculties of human nature. It is a spiritual disease. In other words, it is a disease where the attempt to have the spiritual experience has become perverted, has mutated into something that is unsustainable, that comes at the cost of virtually everything else. And it requires the practice or the ingestion of more and more of the addictive substance or behavior. And the reason why I'm making such a big deal about the spiritual process is to reframe it for those who have no experience with this repetitive attempt to not be present in their life, at least in a conscious way. They have no experience of that, so that there's less stigma about it. So we don't simply look at people that are suffering from this disorder as less than and judgmental. In many ways, they're probably more sensitive, more spiritually open in many cases. They have great gifts, which if they can learn to master, to learn to deal with, they'll have incredible gifts to offer to the world. Paraphrasing from James Hillman, the psychoanalytic writer, he says, addiction is a vertical hunger, a soul reaching for transcendence through a horizontal substitute. I love that idea. We are seeking the divine. We are seeking the experience of being connected. And that seems to be, perhaps, due to our level of consciousness as human beings, a human experience. So when we find something that mimics it or mirrors it, gives us an approximation of that transcendent vertical experience, no wonder we want more and more of that. Nothing would be more sublime. Alfred Adler, one of the great teachers in psychology, in child development and understanding the human as a psychological being, wrote, "The alcoholic seeks in the bottle what he cannot find in himself, a feeling of superiority, courage, and relief from the burden of inferiority." You see, this idea that addiction is tied to childhood trauma is not a new idea. It was in there from the very beginning, from the very first therapy patients, well over 100 years ago. So when we start to think about modern theories like Gabor Mate, what he's teaching, and we think that we're kind of proud of ourselves in our modern world that we've discovered something. This was discovered in the beginning. It was obvious to Jung and Freud and the early creators of the talking cure. Really, it's a listening cure. The therapist is the listener, and the client is the talker. But they're all aware that it is this attempt to not be present with who they are. And so when somebody comes to me, let's say if you relate to more of being a codependent, which is an addiction to controlling people, places, and things outside of you. That's what codependency is. It's an attempt to manage and control people, circumstances, situations outside of you for this feeling that you have inside that is unbearable and overwhelming for you. So no matter what your addiction is, perhaps the best way to understand it is that it's a hack. It's a cheat. And like all hacks and all cheats, it can be very reinforcing. It can be very quick to experience success, but it's not built upon character development, upon our own spiritual and psychological development. Viktor Frankl said, "The existential vacuum manifests itself mainly in a state of boredom, and it explains the mass neurotic triad of today: depression, aggression, and addiction." It's simply a person's best attempt to solve the problem of pain in their life. And as we all come to know one way or the other, if we have any part of ourselves open to receiving information, avoiding pain, not dealing with pain, will cause a life that is out of balance. You can't just cut out the hard stuff. When you cut out the hard stuff, unfortunately, it's inextricably linked to the wonderful, joyful, transcendent stuff. And so you lose all the energy, all the spiritual light, all the wisdom, all the love and the grace that's available to you. Henry Nouwen, I believe that's how you say his name, a Catholic priest, wrote, "Our addiction is not primarily the bottle, the needle, or the pill. It is the compulsive need to fill the inner void." Most importantly, I used to teach this class in preparation for parents visiting the wilderness program that I ran for 28 years. And for, I don't know how many years, many, many years, we had a class that I would teach every Tuesday or Wednesday night, depending upon how we structured the program. And what I would do is have several exercises for discussion. And one of them was, I would ask the question of the group. This is a group of parents that were being led and prepared to see their child. I would say to them, what is something that people do to escape pain? What do we do to escape pain? I would use the words we, and I would say people. I never said child. And having run that class several hundred times, I don't think once anybody ever said that we work to escape our pain. And the reason that is because they weren't thinking about themselves. They were thinking about their children. And since no parent really accuses their child of being a workaholic, it never came up in these brainstorming sessions. Week after week, year after year, hundreds of classes. So what that story illustrates is is we love to think about the other person and their problems and how they're doing and whether or not they're relapsing and what's their relapse prevention plan. And is this a sign of relapse? We love that. We imagine it's a problem that we can solve because we have some clarity about the other person's problem. But the real strength, the real wisdom, the real spiritual muscle in all of this is, how do I compulsively self-medicate? And what is it that I'm trying to avoid in my life? And if we can learn to listen to ourselves without judgment, right? That's the important thing. Judgment will get in the way of listening perhaps more than any other energy. If we can learn to listen to ourselves, to pay attention, to notice, to become mindful, if we can use therapy or 12-step support groups or other interventions to get quiet and listen to what's going on for ourselves, we can learn to metabolize it. We can learn to move through it. We can learn to feel. And in essence, when I tried to describe to my young children what I did for a living before they had the capacity to understand even the basics of psychotherapy, I would say I'm teaching people how to feel. Sometimes I would say feel happy, because they were very young when I would explain this to them in this way. But really what I was doing is I was teaching people how to feel. And one of the ways that I do that is simply by asking them, how do you feel? And then listening to the answer from a place of understanding. Ram Dass said our whole spiritual transformation brings us to the point where we realize that in our own being we are enough. Through attachment-based therapy, through the Finding You, the model that Finding You actually subscribes to, this kind of talking, listening, understanding kind of therapy, this attachment experience that we have with our therapists in adulthood, we have the experience of connecting to ourselves and realizing that we are enough. See, the hard part about psychotherapy is our brains, our cognitive capacities for most of us, the vast majority of us, nearly all of us, our brain is better at thinking through this stuff than our body is at learning it. So we might have wonderful epiphanies, ideas, insights that come to us, and that keeps us going on the path, right? Those are the kind of the trail of breadcrumbs that we follow as we keep going along this process. But the real medicine is the person sitting on the other couch, the person who's listening, who responds to our confessions of idiocy, of regression, of making mistakes, of being a horrible spouse or parent or friend. Listening to those stories without judgment, with compassion, with understanding, so that we can begin to develop a compassionate understanding of ourselves. And to realize that, yes, we are flawed, we are imperfect. But that's not, the idea isn't that we're human in spite of that, we're human because of that. That's who we all are. And we want to be something, and we want to get there quickly. I said this in a recent podcast about the base and the pace of therapy. The number one barrier in my experience of people doing this work is how long it takes and how slow it goes. People want quick cures. And that's why I am so skeptical of modern American theories that promise transformation overnight. And by overnight, I mean in a handful of weeks, because even the overnight stuff in psychotherapy is at best 10 weeks, right? That's the overnight. That gives you some sense of the scale. And that's why I try to be careful with the Finding You intensive. It's not a cure. You won't walk away having all of your questions answered, but you'll walk away with an experience that will change you. You'll walk away with 6 months to 2 years of therapy under your belt. And since psychotherapy that really works on this transformation, this spiritual journey that I'm describing tonight, takes years, 6 months or 2 years traded in for 5 days is a pretty good exchange. I said this to my daughter last night, my 18-year-old daughter, because she wants to be a therapist, and she's asking a lot of questions, listening to me and my other daughter who's a clinical psychologist and her husband who's a clinical psychologist, listening to us talk about cases and insights that we have, and she's listening with a real presence. And I said to her, be careful of people who arrive. Try to stay away from people who arrive, and try never to arrive. And she said to me, I don't think I understand. Isn't there no such thing as arriving? And I said, well, exactly. There is no such thing as arriving, but people want to arrive. I can't tell you how many times in my therapeutic journey I thought I've arrived. It's probably the most consistent mistake I've made over the last 28 years of psychotherapy. Excuse me, 27 years of psychotherapy. Is I planted my flag what I thought was the top of the mountain, and I've celebrated that I've arrived. The problem with arriving is that no further learning is needed. No further investigation is needed. I don't need to listen because I have all the answers and I know how life is. I am blown away more and more how I'm not so sure anymore about what I know about the big questions to life. And while when I was younger, that was the very thing that I needed more than anything to feel a sense of serenity, I needed certainty. Right? It's that old adage that the opposite of faith is not doubt. The opposite of faith is certainty. I wanted answers. I wanted to arrive. And now I'm becoming more comfortable with uncertainty and not knowing. And with that comfort in my nervous system, I'm getting to the point where I don't know much anymore in terms of the big questions, the big answers. But that's okay. I'm starting to have the experience, little by little, and expect to be having it, hopefully having it until I die, that who I am is okay, as imperfect as it is. I can forgive, I can have grace, I can have compassion. And the best thing about grace and compassion for yourself is that it will extend to everybody else. The minute you start to taste the sweet fruit of grace toward yourself, first from somebody else, and then internalize from you to you, the first instinct is that you want everybody else to have it. So, a couple of lists. When we define substance abuse disorder, we're defining it in terms of tolerance, withdrawal symptoms, use in larger and larger amounts for longer and longer periods of time than originally intended, persistent desire and unsuccessful effort to cut down on use. They become obsessed with, everything gets organized around. Their time is spent obtaining alcohol, drugs, or recovering from the effects. Social, occupational, recreational pursuits are given up. And uses continue despite a knowledge of the negative effects. So that's the diagnostic definition. You contrast that with the 12-step program. See, addiction isn't the word, it's called substance use disorder in the diagnostic manual. But when we talk about addiction in the 12-step world, the only diagnosis that's of any value whatsoever is the self-diagnosis. It doesn't matter if you think your spouse, your child, your mother, your father is an addict. That's irrelevant. Unimportant. In fact, I would argue that that focus is taking you away from the most important focus, which is you. The only diagnosis that matters is what does the person think about it themselves? Is it a problem? Because people stop using substances, stop their addiction for the exact same reason that they started, to feel better. And that's only something that can be determined by the individual, can't be determined from the outside in. Self-medicating behaviors, back to that thing that I used to do for the class where nobody would ever point out workaholism as an addiction because nobody ever accuses their child of being a workaholic. The quote that I would share with the group is that neuroses, this is a Carl Jung quote, neuroses is a substitute for legitimate suffering. Our neurotic behaviors still have suffering in them, but they're kind of cheap imitations of suffering. Instead of grieving, for example, the loss that I experienced in my life, I create a ritual or a behavior that distracts me from it. And the beautiful part about symptoms is this. If my symptom can distract you, if you can focus on my drug use or my food use or whatever it is that you're worried about, then I have won. The addiction has won because I've got you off the track of the real issue. So if we can't see the symbolism in the symptom, in the addiction, we will miss the root cause. And in that way, the addiction is doing its job. It's distracting not only the individual using, but the people around them from what is the issue, what is the problem. Cutting, drugs, running, refusing to go to school, right? People that get into addictive patterns seek for a smaller and smaller and safer world by less exposure. Promiscuous sex, TV, computers, screens, aggressive acts, fighting and debating, blaming. Books can be an addiction. School, anything you can think of positively, practically, virtually anything you can think of positively can be turned into an addiction if it's out of balance, if it is used chronically as an escape. When we talk about spiritual bypass, maybe some of you have heard of spiritual bypass. What that refers to is taking something that is almost always associated with positive spiritual growth, but using it to avoid an important developmental task. I'll use an example. If somebody's idea is that after one dies, that all the good people go to heaven, and those folks who believe that often might think that that includes virtually everybody. So let's just use the idea of heaven. Not necessarily inherently a negative idea, but how it can become a spiritual bypass is that when somebody suffers a loss, or when the individual suffers a loss, they don't go through the stages of grief. They don't feel the pain, feel the loss. They replace it with this idea that immediately removes the pain. And they miss the developmental step and they don't mature. And then they don't know how to be with other people who are experiencing grief without platitudes, without offering cheap idioms of comfort. So the work is to learn how to feel. In essence, to develop resiliency, to develop an internal resource or internal resources to be able to weather life's storms, so we don't have to use something to distract from the storm. We can be present in it. Understanding that self-medication is true for parents or spouses. The codependent is in a self-medicating pattern almost always, but they can't see theirs because theirs doesn't have an obvious face to it. It's more subtle, and it often gets reframed as good intentions. It's really important to treat the original issue rather than just the symptom. That's why I really implore my friends who are in recovery to not give up on psychotherapy. There's a saying in the 12-step programs that what happens when a horse thief stops drinking, or an alcoholic horse thief stops drinking, what do you have? And the answer is you have a sober horse thief. There are other issues beyond and broadly, loosely related to the addiction that still need our attention, that if not treated, can eventually develop into another disorder. It's incredible. My daughter somebody came to me recently asking for help. Somebody that I love came to me and asked me for help. And my thought was, I can work with that all day long. I can work with asking for help. And they said, and it was something not too tremendously shameful from where I sit. They said, the problem is I have a lot of shame around this. And I said, I know, we all do. It's very common to have shame around these kinds of struggles and these kinds of failures. Essentially, I explained to this loved one, that's why in psychotherapy, that's really all I'm paying attention to is the shame. Because once I can somehow create a context where the shame is mitigated, is lessened, then the insight and awareness comes flowing through. like a rushing full river to the person. So shame is one of the issues that we have to deal with on our way to healing. The shame and the guilt, the stigma. And of course, if you have a loved one that's struggling from addiction, remember that your task is to take care of yourself and not asking them and their sobriety to be the key to your serenity, because that is the addictive pattern in families. So what's the difference between in the approach to treating addiction based on whether it's an experimentation issue, an abuse issue, or an addiction? And the answer is almost nothing. What we do differently is with acute life-threatening addictions, we have situations both legally and with children where we can place them without their consent into treatment, even with adults, if it becomes severe enough. If it rises to the level of suicidal type of behavior. But after the substance issue is dealt with and the person is safe, we still encourage a look into the trauma, a look into the nervous system, a look into what is it about your makeup where dealing with life and its pain, and for some of us it's a lot, is so unbearable that the only solution is to do something that eventually becomes the thing that takes away everything joyful in your life. And that question, that pursuit, that deep look, deep dive into things is critical. At Finding You Intensives, what I often say is, you won't leave here with the answers, but you'll leave here with understanding something new about your project. And it will be different than what you think when you get there. There's almost no difference whether it's experimentation, whether it's abuse, or whether it's addiction. In fact, I often say when people say to me, well, I'm not addicted, my response is, great, let's keep it that way. This stuff that I talk about works whether you are fully addicted, whether you're not addicted at all, or whether you're somewhere in the middle. Individuals who begin using drugs as juveniles are at a greater risk of becoming addicted compared to those who use as an adult due to the immaturity of the brain, particularly the part of the brain that controls impulses. That's why we need laws and regulations around young person's exposure and usage, is because it's not the same brain. It's a brain that is more plastic and malleable, that is going through a lot of pruning and changing. And if that happens in the context of substance use or substance abuse or screen use or addictions, then the wiring and the pruning is going to be wired for addiction. I was once watching a panel and somebody was asked the question, what would you say to somebody who doesn't accept that they are addicted, when from the outside they clearly are? And the answer that I most enjoyed was somebody said, I wouldn't say anything, I would listen. I would understand, and I would try to create a non-shaming environment, a non-critical environment, where they could more courageously look at themselves and the relationship they have with whatever the addiction is, and ultimately the pain that it is masking. Dr. David Sedlak describes addictive thinking as a person's inability to make consistently healthy decisions in his or her own behalf. He points out that this is not a moral failure of a person's willpower, but rather a disease of the will, an inability to use the will. The peculiarity of addictive thinking, he says, is the inability to reason with oneself. And I wrote, substances can temporarily fill a spiritual longing, replicating the experience of connection. It is a feeling of transcendence with the divine that fills the individual with meaning, safety, love, and/or connection to the whole. This is essentially what our addictive patterns are seeking after. Like I mentioned, if the nervous system of the parents is adequate so that they can sit and metabolize the child's distress and reflect back a sense of okayness to the child develops a nervous system that is less susceptible to addiction, less prone to addiction, less predisposed to addiction. Like I said, it's an anesthetic. Substances or addictive patterns are our best attempt at the time to solve the problem of pain. So the task is to look into the pain, to sit with the pain, because the pain is the way out of the addiction. The only way out of the pain is through the pain. I teach people that you have to learn to be angry when you are sober, so that it doesn't come out in a monstrous way when you are drunk or intoxicated or using. And if you can learn to be angry when you are sober, to set boundaries, to assert yourself, to say no, you'll become less and less angry and need less and less medication or addictive behaviors to anesthetize it. Ultimately, getting into a situation where you can find connection, be listened to and be heard, is an important contribution to the healing, the recovery, the cure, whatever you want to call it, of the addictive pattern. Adam Phillips wrote, "The power of being listened to is extraordinary." Being listened to and being with somebody who takes genuine pleasure in listening is really powerful. It really has an effect. And it seems to me, and it isn't a cure, but if it was a cure, it's a listening cure, not a talking cure. And it's amazing what people will say if they think they are being listened to. And often the connection is the antidote. That's why an important part of the 12-step program is the group, is the belonging, is the membership, the identity of I am in fellowship with. Somebody once wrote, Jessica Benjamin, actually an attachment-based therapist, wrote, "The root of the self is almost always found through another person." In other words, I have to be found in order to find myself. And for somebody to provide that kind of experience, they have to know themselves. Remember that if you are a co-participant, a codependent in this process, your codependency does not cure the addiction in your loved one. And your recovery from codependency doesn't cure it. So you don't cause it and you don't cure it. The only thing curing your codependency cures is your codependency. The only thing that changes, we know for sure, if you get into recovery for codependency, is you. And so it's the thinking that I can cause or cure, that I can get good enough, healthy enough, well enough, that I can cure my addicted child or my addicted spouse. And we learn to see all of this through the lens of attachment, of how Homo sapiens develop. They develop in relationship to the nervous systems of the big people. But when the big people's nervous system are inadequate, are not up to the task of holding space for the child, when they are too anxious, especially when that anxiety is not owned, the child develops a sense of, I can't be safe. I can't be okay. I'm not going to go over the 12-step, but I'm just going to refer to these models. The 12-step does a great job at teaching some of the principles that are involved in the healing process of this addiction. Moving away from control to transcendence. Learning to be present today, one day at a time. Learning to surrender and ask for help. To be vulnerable. Understanding that my nervous system is structured in such a way that if I use just a little bit, I'm prone to use a lot. So saying I, Brad, am an alcoholic, or I, Brad, am a codependent, or I, Brad, am an addict, is a prophylactic against addictive behaviors. I have to remind myself of my propensity, of my weak spots, of my Achilles heel. Participating in rituals and group support and community give me that anchoring and that grounding, and even accountability. And learning to get rid of my secrets. learning to tell the most despicable, shameful things of myself to somebody who can listen without judgment. Richard Rohr, the Catholic priest and great analytic writer, said, the genius of the 12-step program is that it's about transformation of the self, not just sobriety. And Johann Hari, who gave a wonderful talk, if you haven't heard it yet, go look for Johann Hari's talk on addiction, entitled Everything We Think We Know About Addiction is Wrong. He said the opposite of addiction isn't sobriety, it is connection. Connection to others, connection to self, connection to the larger context, connection to the divine. Dr. Robert Schwiebel came up with the 7 challenges, which all center around having a discussion with the individual who seems to be suffering with addictive behaviors that is non-judgmental, that is curious, not confrontive, not using a hammer, but rather maintaining a posture of safety, of non-judgment, and of curiosity. And Thich Nhat Hanh, the Buddhist teacher, talked about this. He said, when instead of telling people not to drink, he teaches them to practice mindfulness, which is what psychotherapy and the 12 steps and the 7 challenges can do for you. He says, when you drink whiskey, learn to drink it with mindfulness. Drinking whiskey, I know that I am drinking. I know that it is whiskey. I know that I am drinking. This is the approach that I would recommend. I'm not telling you to absolutely stop drinking. I propose that you drink your whiskey mindfully. And I am sure that if you drink this way for a few weeks, you will stop drinking alcohol. Drinking your whiskey mindfully, you will recognize what is taking place in you and in your body, in your liver, and in your relationships, and in the world, and so on. When your mindfulness becomes strong, you will just stop. Now, while I think he's offering a slightly superficial cure, the long-term process is it. People go to 12-step meetings, they go to groups, they go to therapy to tell their story and to be heard and to listen to the stories of others that contain experience, strength, and hope. And they do it in an effort to be more mindful about what's going on in their life, to understand themselves better. Motivational Interviewing, which is a wonderful book that teaches therapists how to do therapy without the old style of confrontation, to do it from a safe place. They talk about the same idea. We have to build a safe place, whether it's harm reduction, which is kind of what I'm talking about tonight, in a sense, even though I'm citing some of the other programs. My thing is, if harm reduction works for you, great. If the 7 challenges works for you, great. If Buddhism works for you, great. If Catholicism works, if Judaism works, if Islam works, if a stick works, great. Whatever works for you works. It doesn't have to be my way. I can tell you what works for me. I can tell you my approach. I can give you my experience. But I don't know what will work for you. In the end, the thing that I look for somebody who's ready for recovery is surrender. That idea that I need help, that my best thinking got me here. I think it's really important for people to know that if somebody has a relapse, it's not back to square one. That kind of black and white thinking is intrinsic to addiction. Therapists, sponsors, mentors, others can help us realize the kind of thinking, the kind of regression that is connected to relapse. But when we try to convince addicts of the fallacy of their thinking, it is like telling someone that his or her belief in the law of gravity is a delusion. It's the height of futility to expect an addictive thinker to abandon that concept of reality and accept ours instead. Addicts must lose faith in their current reasoning power, and they must accept the possibility of another version of reality from someone they trust. That's from Abraham Tversky. He said the mother of a young man was destroying himself with alcohol and other drugs and could not understand how he could be oblivious to the disastrous effects that chemicals were having on his life. She asked for help in dealing with him and then said, but don't tell me I have to put him out of the house or that I should not bail him out of jail. She said, I don't want to hear that. And Father Tversky said, I responded, please don't tell me how much is 2 + 2. Please tell me how much is 2 plus 2, but don't say 4. She had been unable, in this example, to see that her own thinking was no less distorted than her son's. It's very common for the codependents to have similar kinds of thinking errors as the active substance abusing addict. So we look for surrender, and that includes surrender for the codependent. My best thinking got me here. I need help from somebody that I trust. Remember that if you are a codependent, if you have somebody in your life that is struggling with addiction, it's a worthwhile task to look at your own codependency and to understand that if your serenity is tied to their sobriety, your healing, your sobriety emotionally is built on a very shaky foundation. Remember that prevention for these kinds of disorders is the same as the repair, the cure. We do the same thing. Just in therapy, we do it for 1 hour a week, whereas if we could have had that in our families growing up, in our family of origin, it would have been present to us in a much more profound way. That's why, and also for neurological reasons, that's why therapy takes so long to undo, to repair, to heal what happened in our family of origin. And mostly, whatever cures, whatever heals, people become very rigid about their version. I do too. You can hear it when I teach in these podcasts sometimes. But the fact of the matter is, whatever cures. And your work is the same. The work is the same, whether you are an addict, a codependent, whether you don't identify as either, you have the same work, which is to become a whole person, to look at yourself, to sit with yourself, to keep going, keep looking. Stay on your side of the street, because one of our favorite addictions is to focus on other people's problems. It's a lot easier. And to come to know and understand, and maybe even share with the person struggling with more of an overt addiction, what your self-medicating behaviors look like. That can feel very de-shaming, very comforting, very connecting to them. And that connection, that's the medicine. But that connection will only happen if you've looked deeply into yourself and can genuinely identify with the person suffering from the addiction. All right, folks. My new book is coming out April 7th. Be sure to pre-order a copy of yours now. Stay in the Room, co-authored with Jeff McLean, Michael McLean, and Brad Reedy. My other 2 books, The Journey of the Heroic Parent and The Audacity to Be You, are available on Amazon and Audible. If you want to join me for a 5-day workshop, very affordable, at the Omega Institute in Rhinebeck, New York, go to their website, eomega.org. That's July 12th through 17th with me and my daughter Emma. Or I'll be at the Art of Living Institute in North Carolina, September 27th through October 2nd. That's artoflivingretreatcenter.org if you want to sign up or learn more. If you want to do a deep dive in your own work, if you want something that will change you fundamentally and powerfully beyond what I teach and talk about, Finding You Intensives is that offering. April 8th through 12th is the next offering. We have spaces available. In fact, I'll say this. If you're listening tonight, or if you're listening to this at all, and you refer somebody, if you've been to Finding You and you refer somebody, we'll give them $500 off for the April Intensive. April 8th through 12th, May 13th through 17th after that, June 10th through 14th after that. For all other inquiries, for private intensives for couples and families, for a coach or a therapist who works in this model, email us at info@findingyouprograms.com or go to our website. The next support group is April 15th. That's the third Wednesday of each month. April 15th is that next offering. I will be back this Thursday for an Ask Me Anything episode that's only available to our Inner Circle audience. So if you'd like to join us, reach out to us and we'd love to have you sign up. $10 a month, you can cancel at any time. info@findingyouprograms.com is the email to use for all of these things. I hope this is a helpful point of contact. I hope something I said tonight gave you some comfort or made you feel connected or seen or heard. And as always, for on behalf of the people that you love and the people that love you, thanks for showing up to these kinds of experiences, because you doing your work, working on you, makes all the difference in the world. Have a great evening, and I'll talk to you Thursday night. Take care. Bye-bye.